bracts that subtend a male flower or female flower. You don't have to know a doggone thing about spikelets to identify Cogongrass. So you guys will be happy that we don't have to sit here like my class does and go through the structures of all these modified grass parts like brome and dactylitinium that I have up here and even Bermuda grass. But it is important, the spikelets of Cogongrass are important to understand where Cogongrass fits in the grand scheme of things where grasses are concerned. Cogongrass is in the tribe Andropogony, and that tribe includes Andropogon. And I have a spikelet of Andropogon illustrated right here. Andropogon and its close relatives, the blue stems, the broom sedges, its close relatives, including Johnson grass, have spikelets that are both sterile and fertile. And it has a pistillate spikelet that usually contains all of these fluffy hairs. And those fluffy hairs are actually what allow the plant to disperse by wind. Now, Cogongrass also has these complex spikelets, and that's one way Cogongrass probably has made its way all around the world. It's because of the very long, fluffy callus beards that subtend those pistillate or those pedicelled spikelets. Okay, so specifics. All you really have to know to identify Cogongrass. When we start talking about where to look for plants and what habitats plants grow in, sometimes that can be very good information for telling whether you have a particular rare plant or a particular invasive plant or not. With Cogongrass, it can invade and live in any habitat that we have that's not flooded for long periods during the year. I just got back from Central and South Florida where I saw tons of this grass growing in old lake bottoms in fluctuating drawdown zones. Now, another habitat we have that harbors lots of rare species in the Carolinas is the drawdown zone of lime sinks, Carolina bays, especially the clay-based Carolina bays that we have so many of in the Francis Marion National Forest. And this is a habitat that in Florida is also completely dominated now, in many cases by Cogongrass. So we need to watch those habitats as well. But there is nowhere you can't find Cogongrass except for standing water. So moist sites, dry sites, deep sands, clays, it'll invade anything it possibly can that's open enough to give it enough sun to grow. It's a rhizomatous perennial, which is one of the ways that you'll be able to identify or start to identify Cogongrass. This the photograph that Gene Everett took of specimen from down in the Francis Marion National Forest. And the first thing to notice are these extensive system of rhizomes. That's how it gets around. Now, many of our grasses have extensive rhizome systems. Some are native, some are not native. But if it has an extensive rhizomatous system, then you can start to suspect Cogongrass. The next thing you need to look for is actually the base of the plant, and that's visible also in this photograph. When we look at the base of the plant, we see this feature of the base of the plant being completely obscured with old leaf bases. Most of the leaves in Cogongrass, unlike many of our native species, are basal and low-calling, which means they occur low down on the stem or right at the ground. Therefore, you can't see the nodes on the Cogongrass the way you do on many other grass species. So look for the absence of conspicuous nodes. Look for the long rhizomes. You still can't be certain it's Cogongrass, but you can rule out some of our native species that you don't want to confuse with Cogongrass. One species that we have in the coastal plain in the same habitats that Cogongrass grows in, especially drawdown zones of clay-based Carolina bays and depression meadow habitats, even up drier around the rims of bays and into flatwoods, we find a species called Florida goober grass. And I love that name because it actually produces these goobers, peanuts-like, right? They're cleistogamous flowers that are actually produced underground. This is currently listed as on the South Carolina State Rare List. Probably doesn't need to be. It's actually more common than we once thought. But it's a species that's native. It's often dominant in the communities it inhabits. And it also displays these tremendous long rhizomes. So we want to make sure, if we're trying to determine this grass from Cogongrass, that we start to take a look at the stem. And you can obviously see on this grass, it has a visible stem, it'll have visible nodes, and much shorter blades than we see in Cogongrass. Another grass species, which in Florida all the time was being sent in to us as suspect for Cogongrass, is maiden cane, Panicum hematomum. Now, anybody who's worked in Carolina Bays or in the low country very long is familiar with those dense swales of maiden cane. Maiden cane sort of mimics Cogongrass, but once again, determining maiden cane from Cogongrass, all we have to do is look here for the stem and the evident blades. If those nodes are evident, if those inner nodes are exposed, if you can see stem material, then you most likely don't have Cogongrass. You most likely have a native grass like maiden cane. Here's a close-up of exactly what I was talking about. This is the tip of a Cogongrass specimen from down in the Francis Marion National Forest, and what you'll notice here is that the sheathing bases of the leaves, which I'll just mark for you here, completely obscure the stem of the plant, so you can't see those nodes. Another feature that Cogongrass typically displays are these long ciliate hairs along the margins of the sheath where the flat portion of the leaf, the blade, extends from the sheath. This collar of hairs is almost always present. There's often also lots of pubescence, lots of hairs on the sheaths themselves. But Cogongrass is an extremely variable species, and you don't always see the hairs on the sheaths. You don't always even see the hairs here on the edges of the sheaths or at the ligule. So you have to look very carefully at other features rather than just ligule and sheath features to determine Cogongrass. Are native grasses that often get confused with Cogongrass, such as Panicum virgatum, switchgrass, native grass, which I think we're looking at now for our alternative energy sources and maybe cultivating in this state before too long, has evident nodes, evident internodes, and no hairs generally on the sheath, no cilia along the margin of the leaves, but it does have cilia that stick straight up in the air at the ligule. So you could confuse Panicum virgatum for Cogongrass if it wasn't for those characteristics of the nodes and the internodes. Of course, if you have it in flower, you'll never mistake Cogongrass. One plant that also gets sent in as suspect for Cogongrass frequently is giant plume grass. Now, giant plume grass is a species that displays a lot of the features of Cogongrass. It's not long rhizomatous. It usually forms tight clumps where you see it. But it does have plume-like seed heads. Now what I have pictured here is not in full and glorious seed. When that goes to seed, when that actually is fruiting, what you'll see is a panicle full of little fluffy seeds, and it does resemble Cogongrass quite a bit. However, this plant displays a tuft of hairs at the nodes, which again are visible, where they're usually hidden in Cogongrass. Tuft of long hairs at the node is visible, the internode is visible here, and the plant is strongly tufted. It's not long rhizomatous like we see in Cogongrass. And while it can be very pervasive in the habitats that it grows in, it's not going to dominate huge areas of habitat very quickly like Cogongrass. Giant plume grass is a native grass. It's a very important grass in wetland systems, so we don't want to confuse that with Cogongrass.